All right, today we're cracking open a case file on one of the most, well, unexpected corners of the US government. No, we're not talking about the CIA or the NSA. We're talking about an agency you probably connect with, farmers markets and those little food safety labels. This time we're digging into the hidden, sometimes strange, and surprisingly heavily armed side of federal bureaucracy. It's really a story about how simple red tape can evolve until it's reinforced with body armor and backed by tactical teams. So, when you hear Department of Agriculture, what picture pops into your head? It's probably something like this, right? A farmer, a field, maybe a sunrise. It's that wholesome pastoral idea of the USDA's mission. Safe food, helping out rural communities, managing national forests. It's supposed to be the most grounded, salt-of-the-earth part of the whole federal government. But then, there's this other picture. That is also the USDA. That's a special agent from their Office of Inspector General, completely decked out in tactical gear, holding a rifle. And look, this isn't just some random one-off photo. This represents a very real and growing law enforcement arm inside the agency. And that contrast right there, that brings us to the central mystery we're unpacking today. It's a question that honestly sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud. Why does the agency in charge of fruit and grain need what looks like a paramilitary police force? I mean, how did we get from checking on crops to sending out armed agents in armored vehicles? Well, to figure that out, you got to do one thing. Follow the money. Look, the story of the USDA's armed agents isn't what you might think. This isn't about rogue cops or some kind of shadowy conspiracy. Nope. It's about something way more mundane and maybe, because of that, even more powerful. It's about economics, it's about the sheer size of bureaucracy, and it's about the inevitable things that happen when you're managing a government program so massive, it basically functions like its own economy.
Okay, so first, we really have to wrap our heads around the sheer scale of the USDA. This thing is a colossal government machine. It is not just about farms. It manages over 190 million acres of national forests and grasslands. To put that in perspective, that's an area bigger than the entire state of Texas. And all that remote land, it needs its own kind of policing. Then, the USDA is the main watchdog for the safety of pretty much all the eggs, meat, and poultry we eat in this country. That's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And then there's the big one. It runs the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. You probably know it as SNAP or food stamps.
Let's just pause on that number for a second. Over $100 billion. And listen, that's not the USDA's whole budget. That's just the annual budget for the SNAP program alone. Just for perspective, that is more than the entire GDP of many countries. It's this vast river of money flowing through the economy every single year, all meant to help feed millions of Americans. And here's a fundamental truth about, well, any system, whether it's government or private. Wherever you have that much money changing hands, you are always going to have people trying to skim off the top. Everyone from small-time crooks to really sophisticated organized crime rings. We're talking about billions of dollars in potential fraud every single year. And when you have fraud on that kind of scale, a different kind of government response starts to look, well, from their perspective, it becomes inevitable. So this brings us to 1978. Now, you have to remember the context here. This is right after the Watergate scandal. Public trust in the government was pretty much at rock bottom. So Congress passes something called the Inspector General Act. And the goal was actually simple and pretty noble. Create an independent watchdog inside every single federal agency. Their one and only job? Hunt down and get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. And that act is why the USDA's Office of Inspector General, the OIG, even exists. It was basically created to be the agency's internal sheriff. So what exactly is an OIG? Well, the easiest way to think of it is as an agency's internal police force. But it really has two different sides. You've got one side that's exactly what you'd picture. Auditors, accountants, investigators in suits, staring at spreadsheets looking for financial crimes. But then, inside that same office, there's a specialized unit of sworn federal law enforcement officers. These are the special agents, the ones with badges and guns who go out and execute warrants to chase down the criminal cases the accountants uncover. And this is why they say the guns are necessary. See, OIG agents aren't just chasing down paperwork errors. They're going after some seriously dangerous criminals who operate inside the USDA's massive territory. We're talking about armed poachers and illegal loggers deep in those millions of acres of national forest. They're chasing drug trafficking organizations that use that remote public land to grow weed or cook meth. They go after sophisticated and often violent organized crime rings that are stealing millions in food benefits.
Oh, and they're also the lead federal agency when it comes to busting up brutal, high-stakes animal fighting rings, which are almost always tied to gambling and other violent stuff. So yeah, these are definitely not victimless, simple white-collar crimes. But, even though the OIG has this clear mission to fight serious crime, sometimes the lines can get blurry. You can see how an investigator who's chasing a financial crime might start to see every suspect as a potential physical threat. And that brings us to a very specific case file. It's a story that perfectly shows how a bureaucratic mission can just escalate into a full-blown tactical operation over something you would never, ever, ever expect. Okay, so our story takes place in Venice, California. The famously eclectic neighborhood. The location is a small private health food co-op called Rawesome Foods. It was this members-only club known for its organic, unprocessed, locally sourced stuff. By all accounts, a pretty small-time operation for a very niche crowd. The date is June 30th, 2010. For the customers at Rawesome Foods, it was just another sunny day in Southern California, picking up their groceries. But for a multi-agency task force, we're talking the FDA, the CDC, and the USDA's Office of Inspector General, it was go time. So what was the big crime? What was the threat that required this massive federal response? Get this: selling unpasteurized or raw milk across state lines. Now, to be totally clear, this is against federal law. The concern is about bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella. It's a regulatory violation, a public health issue, something that's usually handled with, warning letters, citations, paperwork. It's not a violent felony. But the response? It wasn't a letter from a regulator. It was a pre-dawn multi-agency raid. Federal agents, including some from the USDA's OIG, descended on this little shop. And they weren't there to hand out a citation. They showed up in full tactical gear, weapons drawn, ready for a major confrontation, all to stop the distribution of unpasteurized dairy. Once they were inside, the agent seized thousands of dollars worth of products, gallons of raw milk, kefir, yogurt. And then they did something that was just bizarre, something that went way beyond just collecting evidence. They literally poured bleach on all the confiscated food just to make sure it was totally destroyed and couldn't be used. And the owner? He was arrested right there on the scene. Well, as you can imagine, the fallout was immediate, and it was intense. Once photos from the raid and stories from witnesses exploded online, the public reaction was this wild mix of just ridicule and genuine outrage. And critics from all over the political map started asking a really fair question: does a dairy raid really need the same tactical approach you'd use for a drug bust? And really, this gets to the heart of the disconnect. On one hand, you have the official justification from the USDA and the FDA. They say, look, raw milk can be a serious public health threat. From their point of view, they were just acting decisively to stop a potential health crisis. They saw themselves as protectors. But the public perception, that was a completely different picture. It was just heavily armed federal agents conducting a paramilitary-style raid over yogurt. The sheer absurdity of that image was just impossible for people to ignore. So the whole Rawesome Foods raid begs a bigger question, right? What kind of firepower are we even talking about here? Was this just a couple of overzealous agents? Or is the agency actually equipped for this kind of thing on the regular? Well, let's open the books and take a look at the inventory of the USDA's arsenal. A lot of this hardware, it turns out, comes from a federal program called the 1033 program. Basically, it lets the Department of Defense give its extra military equipment, and I mean everything from office supplies to armored vehicles to civilian police departments. It got a big boost back in the 90s to help with the war on drugs, and ever since, it's become this major pipeline for militarizing police forces all over the country, local, state, and federal. And yes, that absolutely includes these federal offices of Inspector General. So what exactly is in the USDA's locker? Well, according to federal records and congressional reports, their OIG has gotten things like armored vehicles. Their justification? For serving high-risk warrants in remote rural areas where suspects could be armed and isolated. Okay. They also have military-grade body armor, night vision, and selective-fire rifles. But then, in 2016, the USDA OIG actually put out a public request looking for a supplier for, get this, submachine guns along with the tactical body armor to go with them. And when journalists and members of Congress asked, hey, why does the Agriculture Agency need submachine guns? The official justification was that standard, almost knee-jerk line you hear from pretty much every law enforcement agency: for the safety of our agents. And that's the thing, right? The justification becomes self-protection, and that's a reason you can use to get just about any weapon you want, no matter what your agency's day-to-day mission is supposed to be. But here's where the story gets a lot bigger than just one agency, because this really isn't just about the Department of Agriculture. The USDA isn't some weird outlier. No, it's a symptom of a much wider trend that's happening across the entire federal government: the slow, steady militarization of our civil bureaucracy. I mean, just take a look at this. It sounds almost unbelievable, but it's all true. The Department of Education has its own OIG with armed special agents who conduct raids, usually for big student loan fraud cases. NASA has armed agents to investigate contract fraud and protect their facilities. Even the Social Security Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, they all have their own armed criminal investigators. The pattern here is crystal clear. It seems like nearly every cabinet-level agency now has its own little police force. And what this shows is this strange but kind of logical cycle. It's like a bureaucratic feedback loop. The federal government gets bigger, it creates these massive new programs like SNAP or federal student loans. That means it has to create more laws and regulations to manage them. More laws means more ways for people to break them, which in turn creates what they see as a need for more enforcement. And especially in the era after 9/11, enforcement has more and more come to mean armed tactical enforcement. Okay, so let's bring this all together. Let's try to deliver a final verdict on the USDA's secret army. What does it all mean? What does a tactical team investigating raw milk really say about the relationship between us, the citizens, and the state? What it means is that we've hit a point where the lines have just gotten completely blurry. Red tape. That used to just be a metaphor for endless paperwork and frustrating government delays. But it's evolved. The red tape doesn't just bind you with forms anymore. In some cases, it now binds you with handcuffs. Now, let's be really clear and balanced here. The USDA OIG is necessary, fighting billions in SNAP fraud, taking down violent animal fighting rings, going after armed poachers. That is critical law enforcement work, and a lot of times local cops just aren't equipped to handle it. But their methods, their growing arsenal, and these high-profile cases like the Rawesome foods raid, they reveal a system that's suffering from some serious mission creep. It's a system that seems to be treating every little violation as a potential high-stakes battle that needs a tactical solution. And so that leaves us with one final and I think critical question. We created these watchdogs, right? These offices of Inspector General. And the goal was noble: protect the system from waste and fraud. But at what point, with how much firepower and tactical gear, does a watchdog that's supposed to be protecting the house become an attack dog that threatens the very people living inside? It's a fine line that every one of these federal agencies now has to walk. And it's a line that honestly seems to get a little bit blurrier every single year.